All right. Well, let's go ahead and kick things off. We've still got a number of folks joining us, and going to have a great session today. My name's Kevin Mickey. I am the current co-chair of URISA's Community Resilience Work Group within our Climate and Community Resilience Committee, and we are the facilitators of this webinar series. I'm very happy to have some colleagues and longtime friends from the Association of State Floodplain Managers with us today. Before we actually get started on the webinar, I want to share just a little bit about URISA for those of you that may be new to the organization. URISA is a multidisciplinary geospatial organization that provides professional education like that, what you're experiencing today, and training. Provides access to a vibrant and connected community, advocacy for geospatial challenges and issues, and lots of resources. If you've not had a chance yet to explore URISA's website, I encourage you to do so. URISA is all about fostering excellence in GIS and engaging geospatial professionals all the way throughout their entire career. So we are glad that you joined us here today. Over the past few months, we have had a very successful and very popular series of webinars on various aspects of climate resilience. Today is a continuation of that with a conversation on the role of GIS in flood hazard identification, analysis, and solutions. We will have opportunities for questions towards the end. If you have a question, we have already muted you, so I would encourage you to put your question in the Q&A box, and the presenters will certainly address those along the way. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Alan Luloff with ASFPM to introduce himself and his colleagues. Al, it's all yours.
Good day. My name is Alan Luloff. I'm an engineer and project manager with the Association of State Floodplain Managers. Prior to that, I worked for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Co-presenters today are Bill Brown, who was with our Flood Science Center, and Jeff Stone, also with the Flood Science Center. Today's topic is the role of GIS in flood hazard identification, analysis, and solutions. Next. The ASFPM mission is shown here. We have two primary missions: reduce the impacts of flooding and protect the natural and beneficial functions of the floodplain. The association has started in the 80s as a group of people that felt they could do a better job of providing input to FEMA on mapping as a group instead of individuals. Today, we're up to 19,000 members, 38 chapters that cover more than 40 states, 10,000 certified floodplain managers. And we put on an annual conference every year. This year, it's going to be in Salt Lake City, June 23rd to the 27th. So if you're in that area or interested, we get about 1,000 people to attend that conference. So the Flood Science Center is one of four main programs at the association. Next, Jeff. And we have a staff. When I started in 2005, I was the only engineer project manager. And today we have a Flood Science Center with a staff of GISers, engineers, research sciences, and a librarian with Jeff Stone and Jenna Moran as co-directors. So we're going to talk a little about the mapping process. And I first want to mention the mapping process prior to GIS. It was done on a work map that was a USGS topo quad. It was photo enlarged. The engineer that was developing the mapping would put cross sections on this map and say, tell a surveyor to go out and get some surveys that were coded into the engineering model. And then those model results, that cross sections, were used to draw the extent of the special flood hazard area. The challenge is that these maps it's not a GIS solution to convert these maps to a digital product. The horizontal control, unfortunately, with the off the quads was not transferred over to the maps. And so the only way to register them is using road intersections, which causes warping. We had a county when I was with Wisconsin that wanted to digitize their maps and wanted us to check them. And we found when we plotted them out, we could not match the original product. And as it turns out, there are 11% of the streams in the country that with flood maps that still have paper maps. The source is the Coordinated Needs Management System by FEMA viewer that you see on the right. So on the next slide, I have a sample of kind of shows how they digitized flood insurance rate map or flood hazard boundary map does not match the topo. So unfortunately, it's not a GIS solution to convert these hard copy maps into a digital product. Next. So firms today are developed where there's good topo available. They use the USGS 3-depth program. QL2 is the minimum standard. Today, they've been developed for 92% of the population. However, some of the low population areas in the country still have no flood hazard maps, not even on paper. On the right, you can see the kind of the map products that you can get. And way on the bottom right is the flood insurance study report, which is kind of the metadata behind the mapping. So here you can see a graphic that shows from FEMA's 5-year plan how while they've mapped 1.1 million miles, and again, 11% of those are hard copy yet, so over 100,000 miles, but then there's 1.3 million miles that are unmapped. And those, ASEPIM has all long been a proponent of getting ahead of development. You don't want to kind of wait till an area is developed to map it. And so we really are a strong proponent of mapping these rural areas to get out ahead of development. The basic components of mapping are, of course, the terrain, which is really important. Today, it's LiDAR data, not topo quads anymore. Then you have the hydrology, which is the amount of water you can expect during the mapping, during a flood event. The hydraulics is how high that water will rise, and this is what you hear engineers call H&H, hydrology and hydraulics. And then the floodplain mapping is where how far those waters will expand to. This shows the mapping process, and the key here is that I guess one of the things I want to mention is that in addition to FEMA contractors, they have developed as part of their mapping effort, FEMA has developed the Cooperating Technical Partner Program, where they partner with states and local governments to develop flood hazard maps. And ASEPIM is very supportive of the CTP program, since the people that have to live with the mapping have ownership in the mapping being developed. So DNR, actually, ASFPM conducts quarterly webinars to support the CTP program, and recording of these webinars can be found on our webpage. Laura Algio with FEMA has done an excellent job of leading the CTP program. And here on this chart, and by the way, there's going to be a quiz at the end, so you have to memorize this. No, I'm just kidding. You'll see the main point is there's a discovery meeting at the beginning, and that's where it's the best opportunity for local entities to really kind of play a role and provide local data to help with the process. At the bottom of this graphic, you can see, and I guess maybe it's cut off a little bit, that the total timeline is in the order of 30 to 54 months. That actually can be much longer. It's a lengthy process to go from beginning to end and create a flood insurance rate map. So next slide. So here they see the layers that kind of go into a flood hazard, a flood insurance rate map. The key one I've highlighted here is the special flood hazard area, which is the 1% annual chance flood zone. This is where the mandatory flood insurance requirements apply. So it's a key item on the map, but there's other information included on the map, not just that. And then the next slide shows how local layers can be added by communities. And usually one that's most often added is building footprints, but there's other information I don't even have listed here. Dams are a useful layer, sometimes stream setback information. So a variety of information can be added. And here on the next slide, you'll see that it's with example here is Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina. They've have a site where they've included a variety of information, not just the flood insurance rate map, but you can see also here they've included more frequent events in addition to the 1% annual chance. And they also have where they've done an analysis to determine future conditions mapping so that they can actually identify as the watershed, upstream watersheds develop, how much flow that's going to be and how much that's going to impact it. So they've got mapping so that they can provide that for new development so they don't are not, because that's one of the major issues that's kind of limited on flood insurance rate maps, that it does not include future conditions. So the local data that really is important to help inform the H&H models is one of the main ones is bridges. And here's a picture from Maryland, where Maryland, when they developed their mapping, they went out and surveyed each of the bridges and culverts in the state. So that's included in their modeling. So it's a very robust set of modeling where it includes the bridges and culverts. Some modeling does not include that. This is a simplified version where they didn't take quite the detail that you do in a normal survey. Culverts, a key item in culverts, there's a lot of communities that capture culvert data, but often they don't capture the invert of the culverts. And that's a key piece if you're going to actually include them in these engineering models. And this shows a graphic of how you can do that in a relatively simple fashion without a really detailed survey information. Another key item that included in the modeling is high water marks. As an engineer, when you're doing modeling, it's really kind of a best estimate, a best guess, especially the hydrology has a lot of unknowns in it. And so high water marks really help validate and calibrate the modeling. And one of the key items that engineer will say, well, geez, but I don't know the frequency of that flood event, so I can't use it. I'm trying to model the 1% annual chance. So we actually have a report we developed in 1914 with strategies to establish flood frequencies. So it helps with that. And so if you have somebody that documents, some way to document the frequency of the event, it really helps. In the bottom right picture, you can see a structure where there's a water line on that building, and they've transferred that to a light pole to keep it more, for long-term reference. When I was after Katrina, when I went down to Biloxi, they had light poles where they painted high water marks, but those were 32 feet up in the air because there was a 32-foot storm surge that occurred there. So that actually was challenging because people had to look way up to see those high water marks. Another thing that can be used is, shows the Texas high watermark database. They've done a great job of capturing high watermarks. The purple dots on the right are high watermarks, and you can see that extent in the left graphic also. Another item that's included in map that can be very useful is aerial photography after flood events. Now, if you get the right conditions where you can get a plane up and can fly it, this shows a flood insurance rate map digitized and overlain on a historic event, and you can see it matches pretty well. So the next slide, Jeff. So how do you go about getting FEMA data? Well, they've actually created an excellent resource called the National Flood Hazard Layer. You can Google that and go to that site. You can see it starts out with the map of the continental United States, but you can zoom in and look at specific areas, and you can see the types of maps that have been developed and how it's overlain on top of aerial photography, a very useful tool. We've mentioned they've got another viewer also that shows their preliminary flood hazard data. So these are maps that haven't been finalized yet, but are in the process. And since the mapping process does take quite a while, it's a useful tool to have this also. So the engineering models, though, that are behind the maps aren't not accessible versus the National Flood Hazard Layer. They're available from the Map Service Center for a fee, but there are a number of entities that that have provided access. And prior to joining ASFPM, I was an engineer at the Wisconsin DNR, and Wisconsin has legislation that requires DNR to approve floodplain mapping that communities use for issuing permits for new development. So since the 1970s, DNR has had engineers that review and approve and archive these models, and they were historically stored on floppy disks. Well, in about 2000, we got some state funding for improving our IT infrastructure. So we hired an engineer with ESRI. You may know Dan Jockish. I actually saw him in North Carolina at our conference last year, and to build some GIS tools to help with the floodplain mapping and data access. Wisconsin DNR has a hydrography data layer, so we georeference these engineering models in those file cabinets to this GIS framework and made them available on the website. Engineers and others can now go to this website and access the engineering models via a clickable map. So these are a list of the entities that kind of are also provide some of the that are cooperating technical partners that also provide web mapping applications for model access. This shows Harris County Flood Control District. They're in the Houston area, and they have to have a check-in, check-out system. So if an engineer can check out a model and check it back in after it's been approved and can keep that model alive. Maryland also has a data download tool. And what's kind of interesting about Maryland is that they not only can you download the engineering models, but you can download a data layer that has the bridges and culverts in them as a separate data download process. Useful for fish passage analysis for the Fish and Wildlife Service and other applications. So with what is not covered by FEMA maps are a number of items listed here. I mentioned does not include future conditions, which we as an association really highly promote because again, you're using these maps for siting new construction, and you're doing it in a fashion that, for structures that are going to be there for 100 years, and you're basing on existing conditions. So here's a nice slide of in California. After 9/11, there was some limitations on what you could show on dam locations, but they've since changed that policy, and you can see how they've developed an extensive group of dam breach inundation maps in California. And then finally, here has a slide, which I find kind of interesting. This is in New Mexico, near Albuquerque, and here's a dam located on you can see a dam located on the upper right of this left photo. You see the spillway down, and if you look at the box on the left, that's actually shows houses that are built in the spillway itself. So sometimes you have to be very aware of the potential risks that are not generally shown, and this was not shown as a flood hazard area. So next up is going to be Bill Brown. He's an engineer and project manager with the Flood Science Center. And take it away, Bill.
Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're at. We'll be talking about urban and stormwater mapping. Before I came to ASFPM, I spent nearly 30 years as a local floodplain manager, stormwater manager, and working in 2 counties in Illinois, city of Greenville, South Carolina, and the city of Arlington, Texas. So I'm very familiar with the challenges in working in urban areas. So we'll get going from there. Next slide there. Typically, what we run into is FEMA generally ignores floodplain issues in urban areas. If you look at, Alan kind of talked about it earlier, they only generally map to areas of at least a tributary area of 1 square mile or greater. It should be noted that most communities that do have maps in urban areas, it's hard to identify the drainage areas less than a square mile, so it typically doesn't get mapped. For those of you who are familiar, like I said, I worked in the Illinois area and the 2 suburban counties in the Chicagoland area. You looked at the map, if you look at the flood maps in the city of Chicago, there virtually doesn't have anything mapped, yet there's there's quite a bit of flooding there, and that's not unusual for most areas. They generally just map the large stream corridors or the large river corridors through those communities. Conversely, on the other side, you've got the EPA, and the EPA encourages mapping because they want to know where the stormwater system is. Why do you have to deal with that? And they want to know where the pollutants are coming from. Typically, the larger communities are the ones that fall under the EPA's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit program. And one of the things that it does require is the communities to map these systems and identify essentially the fate of transport or for illegal outfalls. One of the things they want to clean up the stream corridors, and they want to know if there is a spill or something, where is it going to go? Where is it going to come into the stream? Where is it going to potentially have to, figure out where the cleanups or look out? How do you deal with that? Working as the local floodplain manager, I've had numerous spills that I had to deal with. And one of the more interesting ones, a large truck full of corn syrups rolled over and dumped it into the store. It went into the storm sewer. May not seem like a big issue, corn syrup, but there's a lot of sugar there, creating algal bloom, went to zero oxygen in the system, had a fairly large fish kill. So one of those things is try to figure out where that goes and how to abate it fairly quickly. Okay, next slide. One of the challenges in working, as I indicated before, is in urban areas is here's essentially a map from the city of Arlington, Texas. And if you look at this photo, at this aerial photo, you can tell where the urban area is, and then there's an adjacent area that's still undeveloped. It's in the fringe there. There's actually a stream that runs counterclockwise through the system. The red is actually the stream corridor which is now a concrete channel. Many communities, they come in, they straighten the streams, get it all, they don't want to deal with it. They want to make it easier for develop. Laying out lots against a weekly stream is in their words, difficult. And this generally causes them to encroach and get right up into it. So this is where you run into a lot of flooding problems and things because, again, FEMA hasn't typically identified these areas because, one, it may have been a rural area, now it's developed. They didn't map it before it was being developed. Or number two, when it was urbanized, there's no information in what's going on there. The blue section is actually, I will call a natural stream, but it's been adversely impacted. The red actually flows into the blue. So you can think about it, that water coming in from now, when you add in the storm sewers, which drain all the streets, and the official policy in the city before I got there was get it gone fast before it caused flood problems. All that did is just sped up the system to get the water into the systems that weren't designed to convey that amount of water or volume of water, which led to flooding problems. So I spent a lot of time cleaning up the mess. So it was quite a bit of issues that we had to deal with. So next slide. Another place I worked at, and this kind of goes to some of the issues that you run into with the FEMA maps. This is the city of Greenville, South Carolina. This is the effective firm. This is the one that people, when they go and they want to look at their flood risk, this is what you would go look at. Unusual about this firm is it does have the parcels, the lot lines for the various properties, but there is no demarcation as to which lot is what. So, if you know how many houses you live up from the intersection of the street, you can probably figure out where you are. But it also ran into issues that if there are vacant lots, people, if somebody built on two lots, this map wouldn't show it. You could get confused on where you are in that sense. So it was an issue we had to kind of try to come up with new ideas of how to deal with that aspect of it. If you look in the lower left-hand corner here, though, you notice that the floodplain comes up, and then there's a cross section there. It says C and C on the other end. It's also the end of the study. Most of you are familiar with streams, creeks, rivers. You ever see one that ends just like that? This is an example of the 1 square mile cutoff. FEMA literally just cuts it off. Doesn't matter. Now, I can tell you there's risk up above there. There's obviously a lot of urbanization, and their stream does continue on. Similarly, if you look in the lower right-hand corner of this, there's the lots kind of look this long, slender area. That's actually a lake. And that lake is connected to the floodplain, yet FEMA didn't find any reason to map that lake. And it does have a fairly significant drainage area coming down to it. So you get a lot of strange nuances in urban areas that cause a lot of the local people have to start trying to figure out what the risks are and the issues are that they're dealing with there. Okay, next slide, Jeff. Now this is what I was kind of talking to is this is an ortho base, taking the FEMA flood maps and putting it on the ortho base that the city of Greenville has. And these are actually from the city, from the city's website, where you can actually look stuff up, and I'll get to that in a second. But I've also added in the stream center lines that on that lower left corner there, you see where it's cut off. But you notice there's a stream, and it kind of goes up through, weaving itself through a lot of the urban area. And, it's undefined because they didn't study it. But, how do you know that there's not flood risk there? Some communities have started to map these areas because they want to know what's going on there. They don't want to have development encroaching in there or causing and dealing with flood problems. So it's a situation where you may find that you have data that's from FEMA that shows for flood boundaries, but a local entity may have a whole series of studies that show what flood risk is, and they're utilizing that to manage development. And how do you portray that? Here's a great opportunity if you have those types of studies and to work with the GIS people to make that, or the GIS staff to make that a layer in the system so that you can, when you're looking at this, what all the various risk options are or scenarios are in dealing with this. Next slide. Similarly, whenever you're trying to figure out, you obviously had topo. Again, this is the city of Greenville's topo. So we know kind of where the water's going. If we had an elevation, we could demarcate roughly where the limits of the lateral or where the flow is, so we could see what the potential risks are and work from there in those areas. So this kind of data is of great value. Next slide. As I indicated before, one of the biggest issues is trying to identify, where your house is, or if somebody wants to deal with this. When I was in Greenville, I worked closely with the GIS staff. And what we did is we created an online map server that you could go in, and we used the city's 911 data to overlay with the flood maps and everything. So you could come in. We identified where the streams were, even if they may not be mapped, which caused people to ask lots of questions, and also where the lakes were, and again, caused people to ask lots of questions. Next slide. One of the things that produced was it allowed us to basically generate an individual report. We had the data, we stored all the flood information in the system. It was all tied to a physical address, either the tax ID number, which was also linked to the parcel address, so that we could somebody could point and click, or they could search for information about a specific address. And then you could basically get this report. In any property in the city of Greenville, South Carolina, you can go there and get online. The web link is there at the bottom of the slide. It basically allowed anybody to go in, type in an address, or go into the map, zoom in, click on a property, and you can get this type of report. So one of the things was we wanted to basically open up and make it a lot easier for people to get information about properties and fully understand what their risks were, or at least from a FEMA flood insurance requirement perspective, and then to get them to be informed as to what their potential risks were in the system. So next slide. I want to cover a little bit about how they do mapping and the typical models that you deal with. Models typically occur in three flavors. There's basically steady state models. The steady state models, basically what they assume in those models is that you have the peak flow or the peak discharge everywhere in the system simultaneously. Not very realistic, but it's the way it used to be done. The computers didn't have the horsepower back in the early days to do the kind of modeling we can do now. Then there are unsteady models, dynamic models. These are basically the models that come in two flavors, or 1D, where the water can either go down the stream or back up the stream, and the 2D models, which means they can go down, back, or left or right. It basically can flow everywhere. There's a series of hydrologic models that are out there. The models are kind of all over the place. There's a lot of them out there, but the typical ones that are used in the US are the ones from the Army Corps of Engineers, and that would be the HEC models. Now, the older ones are the HEC 1 is the hydrology model, and HEC 2 for the hydraulic models, but most people now you run into somebody who's doing this. You still see some people using TR55 or TR20, but it'd be HEC HMS, that's hydrologic modeling system, and HEC RAS, and that's basically the hydraulic model, and I'll get into that in a second. The other tools that a lot of people use are the GIS tools to link the GIS databases with the models themselves. HEC GeoRAS basically is a tool that's put out by the Corps of Engineers, and it basically you kind of map where the GIS data is, and it goes and mines and figures it and works. You set it up to mine the data so it can be put in and utilized by the model itself. Another tool that's used a lot is HAZUS, and this is a lot of information on identifying losses, risks, and other, basically a lot of the analysis of what the damage potential is in the system. There are numerous other models, but these are typically the ones that you see a lot of utilized by people out there in the floodplain world. Next slide. There's typically several sources you can get flood map information from. The most common one, the one that almost everybody who's works in local government, are the FEMA maps. Excuse me. These are the flood insurance rate maps. Primary use for them now is they're used to determine mandatory purchase requirements for properties. If you get a federally backed mortgage and the structure is identified as being in a special flood hazard area, you have to get flood insurance. It identifies other types of risk, and it does have impacts on regulatory decisions in the local government, i.e., if you're doing any kind of development or building in and around a flood map or in a federally designated special flood hazard area, i.e., what's identified on a firm, there are certain regulatory requirements that have to be met. A more recent addition to the flood map world, and it's only been out for a couple of years, is the First Street Foundation's flood factor. You may have seen this. It got a lot of press when it came out. It was developed. It's a nationwide flood model based on Fathom flood data. I think Fathom's out of, the UK, but they basically have really pushed this aspect of it. And if you go to realtors.com and you have the choice of looking at a flood, they give you the choice of First Street flood factor data or FEMA data. The First Street flood factor data shows bigger footprint than the FEMA data. And one of the main reasons is it identifies past risk, the current risk, and a future risk, which is typically, I think, about 30, or I think about a 2050 climate change scenario. So it does give you a lot of information of what they project based upon their system of what you could be potentially dealing with. And the last one is another newcomer, is an outfit called Flood Map. They've got some really interesting and fun to look at and deal with system set up, but it's basically live mapping. They set it up in a community. It's primarily developed specifically for emergency managers to deliver rapid access to critical impact data, i.e., where did it flood? Where do we need to deploy our people? And then for other aspects of it, where do we need to go send people to do flood assessments? And where they've deployed it, they've had fairly good success from an emergency response perspective. It hasn't really worked its way into the regulatory world or the insurance world or those other aspects of it, but it is one of those ones that is just kind of now hitting its stride, and it'll be interesting to see how it evolves. There is one other source that you mentioned, but it's a very rare source, and that's the individual communities themselves. There are communities out there that do mapping and do studies, and that because they want to know what the risk, and typically in an urban area, those are those areas that go well into the smaller catchment basin information, so that they can identify what the flood risks are and kind of identify what they potentially could do to reduce risk through the system. Okay, next slide. I'm going to talk about two types of modeling real quick here. These are essentially the either end of the spectrum. And I don't want to diminish when I say this is the lesser model, because it's not as detailed, but it's still light years ahead of what was available 20, 30 years ago, whenever most of the flood maps were created. And basically the base level engineering model is it's basically an integration of geospatial data with the modeling for hydrology and hydraulics. Some people call it automated flood mapping. I don't like that term because it does require, it's not automated. You still have to do a lot of work, but it does provide a lot of information, and it's specifically identified. It's used in a lot of areas, especially rural areas, where there's not a lot of information, and they try to get something out there quickly. The other aspect of it is for those of you who are familiar with flood maps, there's a zone A and a zone AE. A means it's a special flood hazard area. Basically, it's subject to mandatory insurance requirements, and it basically you have to deal with the regulatory aspects of it. The one big issue is there's no elevation information, which is critical for determining if you have to deal with the structure, how high do you raise it. The base level engineering models will provide elevation information so that that is accepted and recognized by FEMA. It's not an official flood map yet in that sense from a insurance perspective, because it hasn't gone through FEMA's formal approval process. It has gone through a FEMA approval process, but not the one to establish an elevation. Now, the USGS has worked with FEMA in 2 FEMA regions to make this type of data readily available. Those 2 FEMA regions are 6 and 9, and we'll kind of explain some of those in the next slide. But there are other states out there that offer BLE data and web resources to get that type of data. Some examples of those that are outside of regions 6 and 9 are Iowa, Kansas, Colorado. These states are not the only ones available, but there are a lot of states that are just kind of moving into this. They're in various levels of development, so there is quite a bit of data available. The base level engineering for the USGS side, you can go in there, put in an address or an area or a community, and it'll generate a report for you. You can also download all the engineering models, all the model inputs, and all the results. So from a data standpoint, if you get the layer information, you want to put it in your system and you can get that base level information for your community, by all means, I strongly recommend you going in. And the states where it's readily available right now through the USGS side are the ones listed there in the lower left bullet point. So there's a lot of information that's out there. It shows you kind of a graphic there, but there's a lot of information that's of benefit to communities and for the citizens to identify what their flood risks are and then start the process of how to manage and maintain that. Next slide. On the other end of the spectrum, this is cutting edge. This is just kind of coming into play. 10 years ago, this was a dream by a lot of people. People were just starting to dabble in it. It's really kind of hit its stride in the last couple of years. It's basically 2D rain on grid flood modeling. And the way to basically describe it is typically in the traditional way of modeling, you would have created a series of small basins and you would figure out how much water, when it rained on it, how much water flowed into a stream segment in each catchment or each small basin, and then how did it move through the system. Well, rain on grid, you ignore that initial hydrology. You create basically a gridding of the system, and you do a complete balancing and analysis on each grid. So you basically apply rainfall on it. You figure out how much goes into the ground, how much is stored, and then which way does it go from cell to cell in the system, and basically start moving it through there. And then it just integrates all the hydraulics in that sense. So it's growing. It's becoming extremely popular. It's still in the early days, but for the areas that I've seen utilized, it's been a very powerful tool. And one of the things that really is interesting about it is it shows where how the water moves through the entire system, not just in the identified stream segments where the water flows into it. So it basically shows you where water can be being held in the system or being detained or retained. So it does, and there's a lot of interesting scenarios that you can work with that. Next slide. The grids can be meshed. There's a lot of different ways of doing it. The one on the left is basically the same grid applied over the entire system. Similarly, there's an example where they tested. You see there's a finer gridding pattern in the primary stream corridors, but then outside in the overland areas, they basically have just a standard structure. So it doesn't require the exact same grid to be dealt with. You size the grids based upon what optimizes, but still provides stability in the system. And that's typically handled by the modelers. But the idea is that basically it will give you the same information and still make the model run faster. And then finally, what does it produce? Typically, when you would get a hydraulic model, the traditional ones, you would only see what you see in that dark blue section. Those would be the only areas that would ever show up. But if you notice, there's a lot of light blue, and those are the very shallow areas. And those are the areas where you have water that's being detained, stored, or it gives you a good idea how the water is moving through the system. If you're looking for areas to potentially site a flood facility or flood reservoir, this might be of value because that's where the water's at. If you're doing wetland restoration, obviously this is where water may have historically been, or it was been cut off in somehow. So this might be an area for a natural area restoration project. So these are the types of things that you would typically run into, and the power and the type of information you could get from these systems. All of them are built upon the data that you get out of the GIS to make these models run. They're basically a handshake off back and forth. So that pretty much wraps up where I'm at. I think the next slide will be me handing it off to Jeff.
Yes, thank you, Bill. And I'm going to wrap us up here. We've got about 20 minutes left. I'm going to try to take about 10 of that so we have some time for questions. So I might go through this quickly, but yes, my name is Jeff Stone. I'm the co-director of the Flood Science Center, as Al had indicated, and I've been, I guess, involved in GIS for about 30 years, since the late 80s, and with ASFPM for about the last 16 years. And just going to talk about how everything that Bill just talked about, combining those flood maps, models, local data for kind of flood mitigation activities. And where I want to start is with from Dr. Gilbert White, who is known as the father of floodplain management, and this Boulder Creek flood notebook idea that he proposed back in 1994. And really, it's an information system, is how I look at it, of what he proposed for a community to collect all of the information related to flood hazards, including the buildings, before, during, and after a flood event. And given the strength of where web mapping has gone today and online, GIS, the idea of a flood notebook is very possible. And in some places, they've done a lot of the work that's already gone into something like this. And so I'll come back to the idea of the flood notebook here in a minute, but where I want to kind of focus on a couple ideas where GIS can really help within floodplain management and kind of reducing flood risk and flood losses, starting with repetitive loss properties. So these are properties that have been flooded multiple times with insurance claims multiple times. And this repetitive loss properties account for almost half of the $23 billion debt of the National Flood Insurance Program. So reducing the loss and risk to these properties could help a lot around the country and reducing the risk overall. And where we started working on this and working particularly, and that I wanted to share, is this GIS training that we developed for mapping repetitive flood loss. And this GIS training is for floodplain managers that have no GIS training at all. And it was to make them feel comfortable getting the data, using the data, and doing some very basic map risk analysis with it. And it was developed with ArcGIS Pro, and it is an online training that's connected with our learning management system and provides continuing education credits too for floodplain managers. And what it's centered around, this one in particular, is an activity of mapping repetitive loss areas. And this is a community rating system, or CRS activity. And if you're not familiar with FEMA's community rating system, it's an approach where a community can join or participate, and by carrying out some of these activities, actually reduce the flood insurance premium cost for policyholders in their community by up to 45% in some cases, if a community is really active in the community rating system program. And the way we develop the training, really what the heart of it is going down using that flood hazard data that Bill and Alan have talked about, intersecting it with your buildings and their building footprints, but mapping then some of those characteristics about the buildings themselves. How many insurance claims, how many repetitive loss claims might they have on those property, and collecting then even more building information, including the first floor elevations, the foundation types, so you can start looking at doing a risk analysis and looking at where and how you could reduce that risk. And there's the other part of this is kind of this reporting and risk communication piece of this, which is also heavily map centric. Another area within the community rating system where there's lots of opportunity for GISers to be involved is this how to map open space credits within CRS. And on the left is a link or shows NOAA's GIS workflow for how to map open space for CRS credits. And so there are GIS workflows. And again, this was written for kind of the non-GIS person, but in a community that has GIS people and has this data, it is tremendous benefit to helping the floodplain manager look at getting these types of credits. And open space credits with preserved green space is one of the higher kind of earners, if you will, of credits within the community rating system program. And if you are in a coastal area and not familiar with NOAA Digital Coast, or if you are, you can get a lot of data in the coastal area from the Digital Coast website. And on the lower left, you see like the sea level rise viewer. You can get all of that data out of the sea level rise viewer and use it locally. But they also have the LiDAR and elevation data. And something we've been using more recently and excited about is the land cover data, the CCAP, which is the Coastal Change Analysis Program land cover, getting down to 1 meter resolution now, which is incredible for some of the other things I'm going to talk about, but just even for the hydrology modeling that is done that Alan and Bill have talked about. Another area within kind of looking at benefit cost analysis for FEMA mitigation projects for funding, you have to have a positive benefit cost ratio. And so having higher benefits than costs. And so 2 areas in the avoided losses and ecosystem services I want to cover quickly are that really can engage GIS people into this process and helping with benefit cost analysis. And the avoided losses I'll talk about first in a couple of different contexts. And, you know, where you're looking at avoided losses, you really need to understand the risk. And so what is that economic impact of those? And I think some of you might be familiar, but this is from FEMA's HAZUS program and their FAST tool, the flood assessment structure tool. But what I like to highlight here is just the structure information. Again, collecting that information of your buildings and information within your community and all of these characteristics about that building, and then intersecting that with your flood depth hazard information, that Bill and Alan again have talked about quite a bit. Then you use these depth damage functions that help you look at estimate what those building losses are, what those impacts and percent damage. You know, if you're going to reach that 50% damage threshold, that's a substantial damage with under the FEMA guidelines. And that institutes some other different things that happen there if it does reach that threshold. In that, doing those risk assessments of the building level, it is those building attributes that I talked about, getting that first floor elevation, but also the location accuracy of those points that you want to. So moving those to those locations of the building footprints, as Alan has talked about, really adds a lot of value. And all these points aren't necessarily at the building footprint location. So you can see if they are where they are or not within the floodplain or within the flood hazard mapped areas shown on the screen here. And where you take this next is you kind of use the kind of project conditions. So you can look at the risk before and after project conditions. And what I mean by project conditions is you look at the current state of your community, or like in this case, this watershed, what does the current flood modeling look like? And then you can apply some kind of project conditions. You know, you can add extra storage that would store more flood water. You can look at climate change. You can look at development and see how it changes your underlying mapping and flood hazard identification. And then look at the difference between those 2 events, and you can look at them, the avoided losses, or estimate those avoided losses between these 2 conditions, and then use that avoided loss estimate within your benefit cost analysis. Another area looking at, Al mentioned the culverts, and you can look at avoided losses to your infrastructure. And so having that culvert information and culvert location is very important, and you can do sensitivity analysis. What you're looking at on the screen, those red and kind of orange area is actually a velocity grid from our hydraulic models for a project. And you can see that the culverts aren't lining up exactly where our hydro enforced elevation model was created. So those points should be moved to those locations so you can actually kind of do some sensitivity analysis and look at the design flow of those culverts versus the actual flow within the model, and just start getting a sense of where those risks are for those culverts. Similarly, for roads themselves, you can use other outputs from the hydraulic models. And this one is a depth and velocity, or a product grid, as it's often called. And you can look at where road closures might occur. And road closures are an economic impact, and if you can avoid the losses of a road closure, then you can use that estimate in your benefit cost on the benefit side of your BCA. Another area within the benefit cost analysis that's newer within FEMA especially is the ability to use ecosystem service values, so valuing the nature's benefits. And here they now have a US dollar amount per acre per year that you can apply to certain land cover types that can be used within your benefit cost analysis. And just on the screen as a quick example, that orange area is the riparian area, which is generally the floodplain. And you can, if you had a project area along a stream restoration project in there and had 10 acres of riparian area that were going to be included in that benefit cost analysis, you would take that 10 acres times $36,000 per acre. And then you would also apply how long the project is viable for. They have a project useful life, and that could be 50 years. So if you start adding up the value of nature within a benefit cost analysis, it's an incredible amount that generally will take your BCA or your BCR to a very positive level, if you will. And another area within the GIS community, I think would be extremely beneficial for in the floodplain management community is when you do community engagement workshops, open houses, and the idea of using kind of participatory GIS and scenario planning. And we've used this in workshop after workshop, and the conversations and discussions when you get emergency managers and zoning officials and even elected officials standing around a table looking at your flood hazard information, and then being able to kind of test different scenarios. Like if I want to do a home buyout here, acquire these homes, you can actually take them off the map in this example for the on the right there, this community health and resource management software, which is based on CommunityViz. You can actually see real-time results kind of in your impact analysis, economic kind of impacts of removing structures from the floodplain. And then kind of coming back around to the Boulder Creek Flood Notebook, everything that Bill and Alan talked about, all of the data, it really is an information system. And places like Charlotte-Mecklenburg have pulled a lot of that information in there, or Greenville, as Bill talked about. And so getting that structure information, those infrastructure attributes, the insurance claims, repetitive loss claims, high watermarks, photos, you start capturing all this information around and for flood hazard management. It goes into planning, it goes into emergency response, it goes into a lot of other areas within floodplain management and just trying to reduce the risk to flooding and the loss of life, and also looking at protecting natural and beneficial functions, which harkens right back to our mission as an association. And finally, just two last slides, something we're not going to dive deep into, but that we're watching, trying to understand better, is kind of two things that are coming out now, starting to hear more about, but FEMA's future of flood risk data. And this is kind of a major change in how they're going to, what they're going to share and how they're going to share it and how they're going to develop as far as flood mapping. And this modernize their whole data management system, but also provide those different flood recurrence intervals instead of just the 100-year, having those probabilistic returns, having depth and velocity grids, the velocity grids itself, the depth grids, all of this information, and including future conditions modeling in that. So this is something we're going to be watching a lot more of, and I think URISA probably has it on their radar as well. And then something I know we've talked with some of the URISA folks a little bit on the policy side is just how is this federal flood risk management standard going to be implemented? And it is a higher elevation for development purposes. So that FFRMS floodplain, how is that going to be implemented? And that job aid that is kind of in the upper left has a lot of information in there around GIS, but and I think NOAA is working on a tool, but I think there's some input there that the GIS community can certainly have in this way. And I'm going to wrap up there. I know we have covered a lot, and we are going to go into questions. And I know, Danielle, we had a question, I think, set up that I wouldn't mind if we could do right now, and then we can start taking questions, or Kevin can moderate this. But we were curious how you all, as participants in this, have engaged, or if you have engaged with your local floodplain manager in your community. So I Don't know if that's still possible to put that up. There it is. So we'd love to kind of get a little feedback from you all if you've engaged with your local floodplain manager and or in the flood mapping process. And with that, I think I'll let Kevin, if you wanted to queue up any questions for us.
Sure, Jeff. I will encourage, we have about 2 or 3 minutes, and if you've got additional questions, there's been a number that have been posted in the question and answer box, and I believe all have been answered at this point. But if anyone else has any, this is a wonderful chance to get feedback from true experts in the field. Gentlemen, before I just do a quick little closing, let me thank you again for your time. I know you have incredibly busy schedules and a wealth of many years of combined experience. It's always a pleasure and an honor to work with ASFPM as URISA's Climate Resilience Committee has done on more than one occasion in the past. So we appreciate you bringing your knowledge and enthusiasm about the topic to the table, and no doubt we'll have other opportunities to work together down the road. On that point, I want to mention to everyone, this is not an opportunity that you're excluded from. We are constantly working in URISA with organizations like ASFPM and others within our membership and so forth to further the goal of community resilience. You are encouraged in the strongest way possible to take advantage of the opportunity to become part of that conversation. And along the way, you'll get a lot of other benefits of being a member of what I personally think is one of the greatest geospatial professional organizations in existence. I do say that with some bias as a past president, but I mean that sincerely. Let me just share briefly some slides with you to tell you a little bit. Actually, Jeff, you need to stop sharing for me to do that. Thank you, sir. Just to close this out. And come over here. And there we go. One more setting. So this is not the end. There are many additional webinars coming up. The Climate and Community Resilience webinar series occurs on a monthly basis. Next month, we will be having a speaker come and talk to you about the relationship between social equity and climate change. It's going to be a fantastic presentation, so watch the URISA website for announcements about that. We have additional webinars coming up on a lot of other topics related to climate resilience, and we're always looking for ideas for even more presentation topics. So if you are interested in a topic, please reach out. I will put my email here, or Wendy or maybe Danielle, one of you can put my email in the chat. While I'm talking, feel free to reach out directly to me if you'd like. If you're a potential speaker, we'd love to hear from you as well. We have 3 webinars coming up in the very near future related to our GIS and Excellence Awards. URISA recognizes on an annual basis communities that have done outstanding work in the geospatial profession, and you can see listed here. We have presentations from King County, Washington, the Pulaski area in Arkansas, and Cuyahoga County, Ohio coming up here over the next 3 months. Additionally, if you have never had the opportunity to attend a URISA conference, this is your chance. This is a tremendous component of what I'm very proud of URISA doing for its members as well as the broader geospatial community. We have ongoing multiple annual conferences, including one coming up this month in Charlotte, North Carolina on GIS and valuation technologies. If you strive to be a leader in the geospatial industry, or if you wish to improve your leadership skills, I strongly recommend that you take advantage of the URISA GIS Leadership Academy. There are many opportunities to attend that academy at locations all over. And we have 2, for example, coming up, one in Seattle and one in Fort Worth. And we also now have an advanced GIS Leadership Academy, and the next offering of that will be in August. And I could not forget, of course, to talk about URISA's annual conference, GIS Pro. This too moves around from location to location. This year it will be taking place in early October from the 7th to the 10th in beautiful Portland, Maine. This is your opportunity to meet and collaborate with and hear from members from across the profession, talking about their success stories, sharing experiences. The GIS community is an incredible sharing community, and learning from you in addition to what you learn from them. And oh yeah, by the way, we have a lot of fun at that conference too. So definitely take advantage of the opportunity. Our proposals for that conference are coming up due next Monday, which in my town of Indianapolis, we call it Total Eclipse Day. So it's very memorable to put on the calendar. And then lastly, if you are interested in being part of the URISA family, we encourage you to take advantage of URISA's Connect collaboration network. You can learn more about that and many other aspects of URISA at urisa.org. So with that, I believe we've answered all the questions. And again, I will thank our presenters for sharing their fantastic level of knowledge and experience with us. I hope everyone benefited from this. I know I certainly did. So have a great remainder of your day, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Thanks.